There are people who make the world laugh, but behind their smile lies a silence the world never hears. Chris Rock, a name we associate with laughter, stage lights, and wit sharper than glass. But few know that his story, the story behind the success, began in the shadows of pain. He was born in Andrews, South Carolina, but grew up in Brooklyn, New York, during a time when survival was the only goal. His family didn't have much. His mother, Rosalie, worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. His father, Julius, delivered newspapers and drove trucks. Life was simple, but harsh. And for young Chris, it was brutal. He was one of the few black kids bused to a predominantly white school. Every day, he walked into classrooms filled with hate. He was bullied, beaten, humiliated. The world told him, again and again, that he didn't belong. But instead of fighting back with fists, Chris fought back with words. Humor became his armor. When the world laughed at him, he learned to make them laugh with him. That's where his journey as a comedian began, not from joy, but from pain. Years later, standing on a small stage at Catch a Rising Star in New York, a trembling young man cracked a joke about his life, and the crowd exploded in laughter. For the first time, the pain in his heart turned into applause. That moment changed everything. Chris Rock's rise wasn't overnight. He faced countless rejections. He bombed shows. He slept on friends' couches. He wondered if he'd ever make it. But he didn't stop. Because every time he stepped on stage, he was fighting more than just fear. He was fighting the ghosts of his past. By the early 1990s, his name began to echo in comedy clubs across America. His sharp takes on race, politics, and human hypocrisy made him stand out in a world full of imitation. And then, Saturday Night Live came calling. For a young comedian from Brooklyn, that should have been the dream come true. But behind the scenes, Chris struggled. He wasn't getting the sketches he wanted, his jokes were being cut, and he often felt invisible. After only a few seasons, he quietly left. People thought he'd failed. But in truth, that was the moment he began to build something bigger. In 1996, Chris Rock took the stage in a black suit, his voice trembling with fire. Bring the Pain wasn't just a comedy show, it was a confession, a revolution, a scream from a man who'd had enough of being silent. That night, he didn't just make people laugh, he made them listen. The world crowned him as one of the greatest comedians alive. Hollywood opened its doors. And yet, inside, Chris Rock still carried the same boy who had once walked home from school with tears on his face. Fame brought money, but not peace. Awards, but not rest. And while millions saw the laughter, few saw the loneliness behind it. Even at the peak of his success, Chris was haunted by the question, will I ever truly belong? Because sometimes, no amount of applause can silence the pain of the past. Fame can be a strange thing. It gives you the loudest voice in the room, but sometimes, it also becomes the echo that haunts you when the lights go out. For Chris Rock, success had finally come, but peace never did. After years of struggling, performing, and proving his worth, he had everything he once dreamed of. Yet deep down, something was breaking. His marriage to Malik Compton, which lasted almost 2 decades, began to crumble. Behind the cameras, behind the laughter, their love was quietly dying. The man who made millions laugh was facing his most painful silence at home. When their divorce became public in 2016, the headlines spoke louder than his jokes. He admitted his mistakes, his infidelity, his guilt, his flaws. For the first time, the world saw not the comedian, but the man. He was stripped of perfection, left only with reflection. In interviews, Chris confessed that he wasn't a good husband. He said, "You don't want to be the guy that has to say, 'I'm sorry,' every night." It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the breaking of a soul that had already been through too much. And yet, life had more to test him with. Because in March 2022, in front of millions of eyes across the world, came a moment that would burn itself into history. The 94th Academy Awards. Chris Rock stood on stage, confident, charismatic, doing what he'd always done best, making people laugh. He cracked a joke, light-hearted, as he'd done 1,000 times before. But within seconds, everything changed. Will Smith, one of the biggest stars on the planet, walked up on stage. No one knew what was happening. A few seconds later, the sound of that slap echoed louder than any applause ever could. The audience froze. Chris didn't move. The cameras kept rolling, the world kept watching, and the man who had survived bullies, hate, and heartbreak, stood still, humiliated and silent. He didn't fight back. He didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, holding back a storm inside him. In that moment, the laughter died. And all that remained was pain. Millions argued online. Some blamed him, others defended him. But no one truly understood what it felt like to be Chris Rock that night. To be struck, not just physically, but emotionally, on the biggest stage of his life. 4 weeks, he disappeared. He didn't talk, didn't explain, didn't retaliate. And in that silence, the world projected its own opinions on him. Some said he was weak. Others called him graceful. But inside, he was breaking, again. Because that slap wasn't just an act of violence. It was a trigger, bringing back years of suppressed memories. The bullying, the racism, the humiliation, the feeling of being small when you didn't deserve to be. It was as if his past had found a way to slap him one last time. And yet, true to his spirit, Chris chose not to answer with anger. He chose reflection. Months later, when he finally spoke publicly, he didn't cry for sympathy. He turned his pain into art, again. He said, "I'm not a victim, baby. I took that hit like Pacquiao." And the crowd laughed, but behind that laughter, there was something deeper, a man reclaiming his dignity, his power, and his story. Through his Netflix special Selective Outrage, he finally told his side, not with bitterness, but with brilliance. He dissected the moment, the culture, the world, and himself. And he reminded everyone that even when life hits you in the face, literally, you still have the power to stand, smile, and speak your truth. That moment wasn't the end of Chris Rock. It was the rebirth of him. A man who had spent his life turning pain into performance, had once again proven that laughter, even when born from hurt, can heal. He said once, "I used to be a big believer that if you just worked hard, you'd succeed. But that's not true. You need luck, timing, and resilience." And that's what he became, the very definition of resilience. Because while others saw a slap, he saw a mirror. A reflection of every fight he'd survived, from the streets of Brooklyn to the stages of the Oscars. And though it broke him for a moment, it didn't define him forever. After the noise faded, the cameras turned off, and the headlines began to die, Chris Rock was left with what he'd always had, silence. But this time, the silence felt heavier. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about a lifetime of holding it all in. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to make anyone laugh. He wasn't performing. He wasn't hiding behind humor. He was just Chris. In interviews later, he admitted something few people ever do, that he went to therapy. Not once or twice, but for years. He began to unpack the childhood trauma that had shaped him, the fears that still followed him, and the pain he never allowed himself to feel. He said, "I learned that I have a form of nonverbal learning disorder, meaning I can't always read social cues. It's why I've struggled in relationships." It was a rare confession, raw, honest, human. The world saw a man who'd always been confident and untouchable finally admit that even he was still learning how to understand himself. And that was his true turning point. Healing doesn't happen in a headline. It doesn't happen on stage or under applause. It happens in the quiet moments, when you're sitting alone, facing the truth you've avoided for years. For Chris, that truth was clear. He had spent his entire life trying to prove he was strong. Now, he was learning that real strength is found in vulnerability. He started to talk about forgiveness, not for the cameras, not for the world, but for himself. He said he wasn't ready to talk to Will Smith directly yet, but he didn't wish him harm either. He understood something deeper, that sometimes, broken people break others. And holding on to anger only poisons your own heart. Through that reflection, his comedy evolved again. He was no longer chasing shock value or validation. He was searching for truth, and in doing so, found a new version of himself. In one of his later shows, he said something that summed up everything he'd been through. You can't control how people hurt you, but you can control how long you let them live in your head. That line hit differently. Because it wasn't a punchline, it was a lesson. A lifetime condensed into one sentence. He started spending more time with his daughters, with his family. The man who once felt disconnected was slowly reconnecting with what mattered most. He traveled, performed, and smiled again, not because the pain was gone, but because he had learned to live above it. When you've spent your whole life surviving pain, laughter stops being a job, it becomes medicine. And Chris Rock began to heal by giving that medicine back to others. Fans noticed the difference. His tone had changed. The jokes were deeper. The pauses were longer. There was empathy in his eyes, a kind of wisdom that only comes from walking through the fire and coming out scarred, but stronger. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need pity. He just needed peace. And in time, that's what he found. He began to talk about acceptance, that some wounds never fully close, and that's okay. They remind you that you've lived, that you've survived. He once said, every person who truly loves you will hurt you in some way. The test of love isn't avoiding pain, it's learning which pain is worth forgiving. Those weren't the words of a comedian anymore. Those were the words of a man who had finally made peace with his story. Because beneath the fame, the success, the controversy, there was always just a kid from Brooklyn who wanted to be seen, heard, and loved. And for the first time in his life, he didn't need the world's applause to feel it. He had finally learned that his value was never in the laughter. It was in the truth. There comes a moment in every man's life when he stops running from his past and begins to walk with it. For Chris Rock, that moment didn't come on a stage or under the glare of spotlights. It came quietly, somewhere between reflection and forgiveness, between laughter and tears. He had spent a lifetime performing, surviving, proving. But now, at 60 years old, he was learning how to simply be. After the storm, after the slap, after the noise of the world faded away, Chris found something he hadn't felt in years: peace. It didn't come all at once. It came slowly, piece by piece, like sunlight through a cracked window. He started talking more openly about therapy, about mental health, about the importance of healing in private before seeking validation in public. He said, I used to think I had to be perfect. But now I realize, all I had to be was honest. Those words reflected a man who had lived long enough to understand that true success isn't measured in fame, money, or followers, it's measured in peace of mind. When people asked if he'd ever forgive Will Smith, Chris never gave the dramatic answer the world wanted. He simply said, I'm not a victim. I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm not going to let it define me. And that was his quiet victory, not the revenge of anger, but the triumph of restraint. In a world addicted to outrage, Chris Rock chose grace. That, in itself, became his greatest act of strength. Because the truth is, he had been fighting battles long before the world saw that slap. Battles against racism, insecurity, betrayal, and his own self-doubt. And through it all, he kept one promise to himself: never let the pain make you bitter. He turned it into wisdom. He turned it into art. He turned it into something that could help others survive too. Over time, his relationship with his daughters grew even stronger. He talked about how they kept him grounded, how they reminded him what truly matters when the cameras stop rolling. He once said, your kids don't care about your awards. They care if you show up. And he started showing up, not as Chris Rock, the legend, but as Dad. As the man who learned that laughter means nothing if you can't share it with the ones you love. When he toured again after 2022, people noticed a different kind of energy in his shows. The jokes were still sharp, the timing flawless, but there was warmth now, the kind that comes from acceptance. He wasn't performing for validation anymore. He was performing to connect. He said in one interview, the older I get, the more I realize, funny is good, but honest is better. And maybe that's the essence of his journey, the realization that honesty outlives fame. Because Chris Rock's legacy isn't just in his comedy specials or his box office hits. It's in his resilience. It's in the way he carried pain with dignity, turned humiliation into humor, and showed the world that brokenness doesn't have to mean defeat. He became living proof that you can be hurt and still be hopeful, that you can fall in front of millions and still rise in silence. And somewhere in that truth, there's a lesson for everyone watching. Because every person, no matter how strong, carries a story the world doesn't see. And just like Chris, we all wear masks to survive. But one day, life strips those masks away. And what remains isn't weakness, it's who we really are. Chris learned that lesson in public. Every scar on his soul was on display for the world to judge. But instead of hiding, he turned those scars into sentences, jokes that made people laugh, think, and sometimes cry. He turned vulnerability into power. And maybe that's what makes him timeless. Not because he's perfect, but because he's painfully, beautifully human. He taught the world that even when everything collapses, your career, your marriage, your pride, it doesn't mean your story is over. It might just be the part where you finally start writing the truth. As the years went on, Chris began to speak more about perspective. He said, "If you stay mad, you stay stuck. But if you stay grateful, you stay growing." And that line stayed with people. Because gratitude, for him, wasn't about ignoring the pain, it was about honoring it. The same way you honor the rain that comes before the rainbow. He started giving more time to young comedians, guiding them, advising them to use their voice not just to be funny, but to be fearless. He reminded them that comedy isn't just entertainment, it's truth in disguise. It's courage dressed as laughter. It's how you teach the world to see what it refuses to acknowledge. In many ways, Chris Rock's story is no longer about fame or failure. It's about evolution. About a boy who grew up being bullied for being different, who then built a career out of being unapologetically himself. About a man who fell in love, made mistakes, faced public humiliation, and still found the grace to forgive. It's about how life never stops testing you, even after you think you've passed the hardest exam. And that's the part of his journey that truly inspires, the realization that growth doesn't end when the credits roll. Sometimes, the most powerful chapters are the ones no one sees. As he approaches the next decade of his life, Chris Rock stands as more than a comedian, he stands as a survivor. A man who learned that laughter doesn't erase pain, but it can transform it. That forgiveness doesn't excuse what happened, but it sets you free from carrying it forever. He once said, "My whole life has been people saying I wasn't enough, too black, too loud, too angry. But guess what? I'm still here." And that single sentence sums up the power of endurance. Because surviving isn't about escaping the fire, it's about walking through it, scarred but unburned. Today, Chris Rock's story continues, not in gossip columns or controversies, but in quiet moments of reflection. He still performs. He still laughs. He still pushes boundaries. But there's a gentleness in him now, a calm that only comes from making peace with your past. And maybe, when history looks back, that's how it will remember him. Not just as a man who made the world laugh, but as the man who taught it to heal while laughing. His journey reminds us that pain doesn't end your story. Sometimes, it just gives it purpose. That being broken doesn't mean being defeated. And that even when the world turns its back, you can still stand tall. Not because they forgive you, but because you've learned to forgive yourself. So if you've ever been laughed at, hurt, humiliated, or underestimated, if you've ever faced the kind of silence that felt louder than a crowd, remember Chris Rock's story. Remember the man who turned pain into poetry, and laughter into light. Because at 60 years old, the tragedy of Chris Rock is no longer about heartbreak or humiliation. It's about redemption. It's about grace. And it's about the quiet power of a man who fell, stood back up, and smiled anyway. When the storm of that night began to fade, the world watched Chris Rock with a different kind of respect. He had stood before millions and endured one of the most humiliating moments in live television history. And yet, he did not crumble. He did not shout. He did not strike back. He simply stood tall, composed, and silent. The very silence that had once haunted his childhood now became his greatest armor. 4 days, headlines exploded across every corner of the internet. Talk shows dissected the moment frame by frame. Psychologists debated his reaction. Fans split into sides, the noise growing louder by the hour. But Chris. He remained quiet, that same quiet that once saved him as a boy in Brooklyn. He knew what the world didn't, that anger fades, but dignity echoes forever. And in that quiet, something changed. A conversation about pain, pride, and restraint began to spread, not just about Will Smith or a single slap, but about what it means to stand in grace when the world burns around you. It took nearly a year before Chris finally spoke. When he did, it wasn't through interviews or press conferences. It was through the only place he ever truly belonged, a stage. In March 2023, under the spotlight of his Netflix Live special Selective Outrage, the world finally heard the voice they had been waiting for. He didn't rush into jokes. He built his truth slowly, like a craftsman shaping stone. He spoke about pain, humiliation, and the strange irony of being hit by someone you admired. And when the crowd began to laugh, not mockingly, but in release, it was as if the tension of a year finally exhaled. Chris Rock did what he had always done. He turned pain into power, shame into strength, humiliation into art. That night wasn't just a comedy show, it was therapy. It was the sound of a man reclaiming his voice from the silence. And as he ended the special with one unforgettable line, "I got parents. And you know what my parents taught me? Don't fight in front of white people." The audience erupted in laughter, but behind that laughter, there was something else. Admiration. Relief. Closure. He didn't need revenge. He needed release. And he had found it, in the same way he had found everything else in life. Through truth, through timing, and through the art of standing tall when the world expected him to fall. Today, at 60, Chris Rock is no longer just a comedian. He is a survivor. A teacher of grace. A mirror to humanity's chaos and calm. He's lived through poverty, racism, heartbreak, and betrayal, and turned all of it into laughter that heals others even when it came from wounds of his own. His childhood silence taught him endurance. His years of struggle taught him humility. And that slap, the moment that froze the world, taught him transcendence. Behind the fame and fortune, Chris remains the same man who once walked through Brooklyn streets with holes in his shoes and jokes in his pocket, chasing the dream that pain itself had handed him. He still walks with the quiet rhythm of someone who knows that peace isn't found in applause, but in forgiveness. And yet, there's a heaviness too, not the weight of bitterness, but of truth. He's said it himself in interviews since, "I'm not a victim. I don't ever want to be one." Those words define him more than any award ever could. His resilience didn't come from strength alone, it came from years of learning how to stay still when the world wanted him to scream. And that's why, even after everything, he's still standing, still performing, still reminding the world that laughter, real laughter, is born from pain, but it can end in peace. As the lights fade on his 60th year, the story of Chris Rock is not one of tragedy, but of triumph through pain. He has lost things, love, trust, innocence, but gained something far more profound, understanding. When the crowd cheers for him now, they're not just celebrating his comedy. They're celebrating the man who turned life's cruelest moments into lessons for the soul. They're celebrating endurance, forgiveness, and that unbreakable spirit that refuses to bow to bitterness. Chris Rock has never needed to be the loudest voice in the room, only the most honest. He has shown the world that sometimes, silence can speak louder than any punchline. That the greatest act of courage isn't fighting back, it's walking away with your head held high. And maybe, that's the real legacy of Chris Rock. Not the fame. Not the awards. Not even the jokes that changed comedy forever. But the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who faced pain with grace, and taught the world that laughter isn't the opposite of sorrow, it's the proof that we survived it. So when the world looks back on his 60 years, it won't just remember the slap, or the specials, or the stardom. It will remember the man who turned every silence into a symphony. The boy who learned to laugh before he could breathe, and never stopped. The voice that was once born from pain, and now echoes with peace. Because some stories don't end in applause. They end in understanding. And Chris Rock's story, though filled with heartbreak, humiliation, and fire, ends with something far rarer. A quiet victory.